Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, is it possible to sincerely wish for the well-being of sentient beings that you haven't even met? With human beings, our care and concern for sentient beings around us rarely extends past our sightline. Is it possible to overcome the fog of the unknown and the unseen to realize compassion for those we do not know?
The Buddha would say yes, that is possible, and I think that I agree with him. You're right that it's hard, and that to do so goes against our default state, but I think that with sustained practice, one can overcome that fog.
What sort of practices would you have to do?
Just like training for a marathon, where you would have to run for increasingly longer distances until the full distance is doable, you would have to practice extreme, boundless, and sincere compassion for those closest to you, then those a little farther from you, and then those farthest from you. You have to practice compassion in ever-expanding spheres. Your meditation must be the same, visualizing beings increasingly distant from you to include under the wing of your compassion. Similarly, through meditation, you must perfect your compassion by making it not be selfish, ignorant, or misguided.
That seems plausible, I suppose. Humans cannot, by default, run that many miles in one go, but through exercise and training, we see that such a thing is achievable. It can be just so with compassion as well.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we'll be discussing Bodhicitta. What is Bodhicitta in Buddhism? Isn't it technically a desire? How does one arouse Bodhicitta? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get into it. What is Bodhicitta in Buddhism?
Bodhicitta is a concept that's quite common in Mahayana Buddhism in relation to the Bodhisattva path. It is a conjunction of the words Bodhi, meaning enlightenment, and Citta, meaning mind. In Chinese, it is read Pu-ti-shin, and in Japanese, it is Bodai-shin. The whole term directly translates to something like enlightenment mind, and it refers to the aspiration, desire, or urge to remedy the dukkha of all sentient beings, including yourself. As you can see from this definition, it's a state of mind characteristic of bodhisattvas, which comes after reaching a certain level of enlightenment and erasure of hindrances and afflictions, but right before you start making vows to end everybody's dukkha. In other words, the reason bodhisattvas make their bodhisattva vows to construct a pure land and to end all sentient beings' dukkha is because they have awoken bodhicitta. To put it in a linear progression of events or states of mind, we could say that first, one meditates and trains to erase all self-centered thinking and delusions of selfhood. Then they train to cultivate universal compassion, or karuna. This universal compassion is a cause for bodhicitta, the desire, the urge, the aspiration to remedy dukkha. All bodhisattvas and Buddhas have it all the time, and it's something that Mahayana Buddhism teaches that all beings everywhere should aspire to. It's a state, like many others on the bodhisattva path, from which you cannot usually come back. If you awaken it in this rebirth, you cannot lose it in the next rebirth or any other following rebirth. The reason for that is that it necessarily changes one's behavior in a permanent fashion. It is often awakened by satori, which we discussed in episode 97, and it's thought to be such a transformative experience that you're inescapably on track to become a fully realized bodhisattva and even a fully realized Buddha once you have it. According to the Bodhisattvabhumi, a text that describes bodhisattva path, there are two stages of the development of bodhicitta. The kind of bodhicitta which can be lost because it is incomplete or inauthentic, and the permanent kind of bodhicitta which cannot be lost and leads directly to enlightenment. Furthermore, we can also break it down by bodhicitta which is being acted upon, and bodhicitta which isn't, again, because it's incomplete or insufficient. Obviously, bodhicitta which can be lost and which isn't being acted upon are lesser stages of development, and it's debatable whether they are actually bodhicitta according to the definition given. Additionally, it's important that we not secularize this term. Universal compassion and a desire to alleviate suffering, not dukkha, but suffering, seems like a concept that is highly applicable outside of a religious context. It could be easy to think that bodhicitta is the desire to help the homeless be housed, help the hungry be fed, and help the needy in general. While this is somewhat true under the definition of karuna, it is important to remember that the way that bodhicitta aspires to alleviate suffering is by specifically leading all sentient beings to Buddhahood. Helping people materially may be part of doing that, but the end goal is not just making sure every sentient being is safe and happy and cared for. It's also leading them to a state where they no longer have desires and attachments, no longer have dukkha, and have established themselves firmly in knowing and living the Buddha Dharma. While this is regarded in Buddhism as being a universal truth, it is, in our scholarly terms, a religious truth as well. The same can be said of Christian salvation. We can secularize the term salvation and think that it means saved from poverty, saved from hate, saved from bad circumstance, but the term actually refers to saved from going to the Christian hell as a result of not believing in the Christian gospel. According to the Bodhisattvabhumi, bodhicitta comes about when a person thinks to themselves, quote, "Oh, may I attain supreme and perfect enlightenment, promote the good of all beings, and establish them in the final and complete nirvana and in the Buddha knowledge," unquote. Thus, you can see, it has a very religious end goal. Awakening bodhicitta is also thought to create a self-sustaining chain reaction. If I awaken bodhicitta in myself and I act upon it by being compassionate, then that will lead others to awaken bodhicitta, and then they will act on their bodhicitta and act compassionately, and lead others yet more to bodhicitta, and so on and so forth. Thus, awakening bodhicitta and acting upon it is massively good karma because it propagates the Dharma to an exponential scale. Awakening bodhicitta in yourself and in others is thought to be an act of incalculable merit because of the measure of its effect on the world around us. I would also like to briefly step over into Tibetan Buddhist doctrine, where bodhicitta also appears, but in different ways. In Tibetan Buddhism, there is a distinction made between absolute and relative bodhicitta. Relative bodhicitta is a state where somebody seeks to enlighten and save all sentient beings as though they were oneself. This is sort of like the golden rule. I treat you well because I want to be treated well by you. The golden rule is good for making people step out of their own perspective on the world and see it from another's perspective, but it still prioritizes the self. The moral imperative is to treat others well because that's how you want to be treated, not because of anything to do with the act of doing good or with the moral or religious implications of doing good. Thus, relative bodhicitta is contrasted with absolute bodhicitta. This is bodhicitta that comes from knowledge of emptiness and true selflessness, in the sense that all sentient beings are selfless, or subject to no self. While absolute bodhicitta is more firmly established in prajna, or wisdom, both types are still good, because both cases lead to a person being morally good and advancing on the bodhisattva path. In Tibetan Buddhism and Vajrayana Buddhism in general, the absolute and the relative, as modes of existence and truth in general, are both fleshed out and defined to a great extent, and instead of emphasizing the superiority of the absolute, such as the Mahayana does, Vajrayana regards both modes as being valid and inherently linked and overlaid with each other. Thus, both modes are valid for advancement on the path of enlightenment.
Isn't bodhicitta technically a desire?
It depends on who you ask. When you set a goal for yourself, is there necessarily a desire for that goal's realization? In particular, we're using the word desire in the Buddhist sense. Desire that is karmically good, bad, or neutral, desire that reifies the self, desire that reinforces ignorance, and desire that is truly insatiable by nature. If your goal is the Buddhahood of all sentient beings, including but not limited to yourself, that itself is a karmically good desire in some senses of the word. It's often thought of as the last desire that bodhisattvas hold on to, and that is the one that holds them back from fully realized Buddhahood. However, even a karmically good desire can lead to attachment, dukkha, and karmically bad behaviors. It can also reify the self and reinforce ignorance. For example, if one overemphasizes the role of self in the bodhisattva path, they can begin to have delusions of grandeur, where they think of themselves as a messiah figure, or they can become glory-seeking, or obsessed with racking up the largest number of salvations out of any other bodhisattva. These are pitfalls that one falls into without complete and true bodhicitta.
This result is part of why I distrust concepts like upaya here. This self-centered, unskillful idea of bodhicitta combined with an unskillful interpretation of upaya combines into a really toxic situation that empowers abusers. Now, to be clear, this is the result of humans doing it wrong, not the ideas itself, not the bodhisattvas involved. Like, there is a real version of this, and what I'm talking about is a tainted version, but it's still an interaction that seems obvious and seems abusable in a way that just ekes me out a bit.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't want to be all no true Scotsman about it, but people who do what you're describing generally are not regarded as doing bodhicitta or bodhisattvahood correctly, even by other Buddhists. There are plenty of examples in the sutras where the Buddha says, if a bodhisattva has even a single thought of self, or even a single thought like, I am a bodhisattva, then he's not a real bodhisattva because he's too self-oriented. And so, luckily, the doctrine sort of puts those people down for doing what they're doing, which is problematic in many cases.
For what it's worth, this is a case where no true Scotsman applies because the abuser is not true. But humans are not very good at evaluating that, and abusers know that. So, the problem is with people, not with the doctrine.
Yeah, and I can see why. So back to the script, I wanted to mention that because we've discussed how you can have a goal without that goal being an object of desire, we can also understand bodhicitta as not being a desire as well. In this sense, it's more like a state of mind, or a worldview, or a path to be on, without any attachment regarding the path's terminus. This understanding is closer to how bodhicitta is taught and thought of throughout most of history. This issue of teleology is very important in considering whether or not bodhicitta is a desire. For reference, teleology is a philosophical term that means that something points at an end, rather than at a means. It comes from the Greek telos, meaning end as in telomeres, the end bits on chromosomes, or telephones, the ends of a communication channel. Desires have an object of that desire, and that object is the telos of that desire. If you have a desire for the telos, then bodhicitta is a desire. If you don't, it isn't. I think both interpretations are equally prevalent and equally informative as to how bodhicitta works. Bodhicitta comes close to having overlap with another term, jihi in Japanese. The first character, ji, means mercy, pity, or benevolence, and the second character, hi, means to impart joy upon others. Together, the term refers simultaneously to the state of being compassionate and merciful towards others and the state of acting upon that to impart joy on them. This sounds quite similar to bodhicitta, but it's actually a lot less teleological than bodhicitta. Jihi has Buddhist uses and connotations, but Buddhism is not directly implicated in its definition. In other words, it is used in Buddhist contexts with a religious overtone, but it's neutral by itself, much like we said the word salvation is in English. Bodhicitta says bod or bud in the first syllable, and immediately implicates a religious telos in its definition. What happens to bodhicitta when you reach Buddhahood? If you take the stance that bodhicitta is a desire, then technically it's eliminated as a state of being before one reaches full Buddhahood, a state that is entirely free from all desire and attachment. Given that Buddhahood is a wholesome and positive state, how could it be good to eliminate bodhicitta? There are a few answers to this question. One is to wipe away your desire for bodhicitta, but not eliminate the state of mind, or the being that defines it. You no longer desire for the telos, but you're still on the path that leads to it. Another more complex answer is that bodhicitta is fulfilled by one becoming a Buddha. Bodhisattva vows often follow the formula, if X condition is not fulfilled, may I not become a Buddha. Thus, their becoming a Buddha, after they've done all of their bodhisattva work, directly implies the fulfillment of X condition. The idea of bodhicitta being fulfilled is actually more complicated than it sounds. We might think that bodhicitta can never really be fulfilled because there are always beings who exist in a state of dukkha, and this is true, but it doesn't mean that bodhicitta can never be fulfilled. One way that it can be fulfilled is by fulfilling another condition of Buddhahood, which is preaching the Dharma. That starts the self-sustaining chain reaction that we mentioned earlier, that fulfills bodhicitta. Another way is through realizing Buddha nature or original enlightenment. By that realization, one of two things could happen. You could realize that bodhicitta is already fulfilled and always has been, or you could realize that the way to fulfill it is to preach the Dharma to people and open their eyes up to their own Buddha nature.
How does one arouse bodhicitta?
Unlike other concepts in Mahayana we have encountered, where realizing it is a vague matter of meditation, study, and practice, bodhicitta has some specifically prescribed means of being cultivated. Meditation, study, and practice are obviously a constant part of it, but there are other things that people can do as well. One is being a part of the self-sustaining chain reaction we keep mentioning, which was started by somebody who has already awakened bodhicitta. If you insert yourself into that reaction, you are more likely to arouse bodhicitta yourself. In real-world terms, we are referring to relying on a Zen Chishiki, or a friend in the good. This could be a teacher, an acquaintance, an example you read about, or any other person you know who is well established on the Buddhist path. By associating with them and relying on them and spending a lot of time with them, you're more likely to arouse bodhicitta because their bodhicitta and their compassion and their good nature is powerful enough to affect you and your nature. In real life, this refers to our actions being influenced by who we associate with. If we associate with extremely compassionate and beneficent people for long enough time, it will necessarily make us more compassionate and beneficent ourselves. Another way to realize bodhicitta is to take refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and develop spiritual qualities such as faith, mindfulness, and wisdom. In other words, if you practice the Mahayana Buddhist path, you will arouse bodhicitta at some point if you keep practicing it. To use a karate analogy, bodhicitta is like the brown belt, or the belt that comes right before black. You have to go through the brown belt step to get to the black belt. It's not an optional thing. As part of the meditative practices which lead to the arousal of bodhicitta, you will contemplate the shortcomings of samsara, such as dukkha, attachment, and delusion. Additionally, you will contemplate the benefits of arousing bodhicitta and the downsides of foregoing it. You'll eventually want to stop thinking of it in such instrumental terms, or in terms of using it for its benefits, but these simple terms are a good starting place. It's important to remember that bodhicitta may have religious connotations and significance, but like we said earlier, Buddhism regards every sentient being as being on the path at one stage or the other. So it's universal in that sense. One can make significant progress in the Buddhist sense without explicitly practicing Buddhism or following the Buddha Dharma. I bring this up because Buddhist thinkers have often regarded non-Buddhists as being bodhisattvas. People who have exhibited extreme compassion for all sentient beings are said to have aroused bodhicitta regardless of if they self-identify as Buddhists. This is a complicated thing because the universality of the Bodhisattva path has been overemphasized in the process of secularizing and modernizing Buddhism, and so we should be skeptical. But the universality is also a textual, doctrinal, and ritual reality, and so we can't ignore it. The current Dalai Lama, for example, once said that he regarded Mother Teresa as one of the greatest bodhisattvas that ever lived, no doubt referring to her more popular reputation than to the realities of her life that have since come to light. The monk at my local temple also once said that Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, was a great bodhisattva as well when he died. We should not ignore the secularizing agenda of such declarations, but we should also note that bodhicitta is regarded as being a universal phenomenon.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of bodhicitta in Buddhism. Join us next week where we will be discussing the position of the Dalai Lama. What is a Dalai Lama? What is the meaning and significance of that position? Who is the Dalai Lama today? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. If you would like to support the show, we ask instead that you send that support to the Trevor Project, a nonprofit that focuses on suicide prevention efforts for LGBTQ youth. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.